My grandmother lived in a large apartment complex in Cincinnati, and she was of the era where you learned how to repair clothes. And she was also of the Depression era where you learned never to throw anything away. And so she had this box, and she would break it out when she was about to sew something. And inside of it were this great variety of items that could theoretically be used for sewing. A red and black polka dot patch, a piece of denim, mismatching brown buttons, some strips of cloth, and lots of thread. She was so determined to save things that even if that thread was not on a spool, even if it was just a tangled lump, she would pack it into that box. And so this box, which was quite overstuffed, every time she'd open it, it would just be this confusion of different items that could theoretically be used for sewing. The funny thing is, I hardly ever remember her picking something out of it to use. If she was going to sew something, she actually had a sewing kit, which was much tidier, and she would frequently just resort to that. The stuff that was kept in the sewing box, if I had to guess, was just too messy and chaotic to deal with. Been thinking a lot about stories this week. Our story with Jonathan, our incredible congregational life and education coordinator, that story is coming to an end. Our story with Ann Clow, who was our intern for 3 years and who will now be taking over the role of congregational life and education coordinator for an interim period, that story begins a new chapter. And then the stories of Brian and Cheryl and Dawn and others about the ways that their volunteerism has made a difference in their own lives and also in the lives of others. Those stories are with me in my heart today as well. My friend and colleague out in California, she has this poster in her office. And I've mentioned what it says in a previous sermon, but I like it so much, I'm going to say it again. It reads, "People are not made from atoms. People are made from stories." People are made from stories. And what I like about that quote is that it shows the ways that narrative or story shapes our experience. Without a narrative, our lives become just this collection of random events, activities, happenings, transpirings, an overstuffed box of curios and novelties. Story or narrative, that sews our lives together in ways that are intelligible to us. There is a power in storytelling, a power that takes the raw material of our life and starts to make sense of it. It starts to create a form, a shape, a mold that gives us meaning. And so I was thinking about the concept of this sermon, the power of stories, and this is what comes to mind. The power of stories is really our ability to shape meaning out of the many disparate parts, the many disparate actions and activities and events, and begin to sew together a kind of meaning into our lives. I don't think that we have total power over how our story is shaped. Rather, I think it's probably more accurate to say, rather than that we shape our stories, I think it's more accurate to say it's our stories that shape us. We are embedded within particular stories. We see ourselves reflected in certain narratives, and that starts to provide meaning to us. The Canadian philosopher Alistair MacIntyre discusses something close to this book, to this concept in his book, After Virtue. He criticizes modern philosophy because modern philosophy thinks that human beings can answer the question of what is just and good in a completely individual way. That we can sort of sit down and reason our way to a concept of the good or the just. It tries to answer the question of what is good without grounding it in a particular story of where a person and a community comes from and where that person and community is going. For MacIntyre, we are only able to answer the question of what is right and good when we understand that we are coming from a particular place and we are going towards a place. There should be a span here, one in which we are moving from imperfect realization of the just and the good to a more perfect, to a better realization of that justice and goodness. The story of Unitarian Universalism fits within this conception. Its story is not a perfect story. We Unitarian Universalists sometimes speak of our origins and of its lofty and courageous beginnings, how it was always on the side of freedom and justice, and there are elements to that for sure. But there are also deep imperfections. We have struggled for a long time with our own forms of racism and classism and exclusion. From a narrative perspective, it is crucial that we are able to name those realities, to name those origins. And it is also crucial to understand where it is that we are heading towards, what it is that we are trying to achieve, where we are headed, where we end up when all of this is said and done. MacIntyre would say that it's only in the context of understanding where we are going that it makes sense to say that something is good or bad, a virtue or a vice. If, for example, we hope to realize greater equality and justice, that hope has meaning to the extent that it is embedded within a particular community that is seeking to better its practices of equality and justice, to more deeply and perfectly realize them. This conception of story makes a lot of sense to me. Personally, I know that my own views of what is just and true and good and moral emerge from within our faith community. I have been shaped by Unitarian Universalist communities that wrestle with these questions. It's by being embedded within a community that is seeking equality and justice that the story of my life has found its purpose and meaning. Being embedded within a community story also challenges us. It pushes us. It makes us better when we give ourselves over to its narrative of betterment, of trying to become better in terms of justice and goodness. It encourages us to continually look towards the ways that our conceptions of what is good just don't pass muster, and how we have to improve ourselves, our hearts, and our habits. In this way, the story of being in community can easily be about how our world gets turned upside down and is shaken up, and that is a good thing. That is a beneficial thing when we find ourselves in communities whose stories do that to our hearts and our experience. This is the story of how what you thought was good and true turned out to be inadequate. And you have to drastically broaden the frame, the perspective that you have, because you're learning a new story, something better and different. Eva Pechtel is one of our young adults who grew up in this congregation. And she went down with me and a group of other adults and youth to Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma for a civil rights tour. We went to the lynching memorial, and we went to the Bryan Stevenson Museum. And I knew that I was deeply impacted by that experience. I knew that I was realizing my perspective had been limited and inadequate until I went down there and had a different and fuller story told to me. And I think that Eva had a similar experience. When she came back, she said that the experience had changed her so much that she decided to go to college in Montgomery, which is where she is at now. That experience changed her so much that she decided to focus on criminal justice and human rights in her education. And I just learned this week that she has just now become an intern at the Institute for Human Rights. When we embed ourselves in communities whose stories are seeking greater justice and goodness and truth, our stories don't stay intact. They get shaken up. Embedding ourselves within a community that is seeking justice changes our stories. It changes them for the better. Remember that box of thread and fabric and buttons and patches? The one that my grandma kept in her apartment? I think that without a story, without a narrative, without a broader community that helps us frame our search for what is good and just, our lives start to look like that box. We become a collection of dissembled parts that don't make a lot of sense together. They just happen to be thrown together. Parts that don't have a lot of use. But when we embed ourselves within a community that is seeking truth and goodness and justice, that is seeking to make the world a more whole and beautiful place, then our lives are stitched into a community that makes us whole, that completes our stories. They are woven into a story that holds them and makes them complete. That is when we start to find meaning, as we are woven into the fabric of a community. Spiritual companions, may we find those threads. May we become more deeply woven into community. Amen.